The blood-soaked soil beneath the soldiers' boots told a story older than the nation itself, that terrain shapes destiny as surely as generals shape battles. As Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Fremantle of the British Army observed from the Confederate lines on that fateful afternoon of July 3, 1863. The attacking force would have to advance nearly a mile across open ground under artillery fire from heights on all sides. It seemed impossible that any force could survive such an assault, much less prevail. His prophetic observation would echo through military academies for generations to come. The sleepy Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg had never sought prominence on the world stage. With its 10 roads converging like spokes on a wheel, the settlement stood as little more than a transportation hub surrounded by rolling farmland and rocky ridges. Yet these geographical features, seemingly unremarkable to the casual observer, would transform this crossroads into the pivotal battlefield of the American Civil War. General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had marched north with confidence through the Cumberland Valley in June 1863. Fresh from victory at Chancellorsville, the Confederate forces sought to take the war to northern soil, hoping to influence northern public opinion and potentially gain European recognition. What Lee could not anticipate was how the Pennsylvania landscape would conspire against his strategic vision. The town's radiating roads served as a natural magnet, drawing both armies together, wrote historian Edwin Coddington in his landmark work, The Gettysburg Campaign. No commander specifically chose Gettysburg. Rather, geography chose it for them. As Confederate General Henry Heth's division approached from the northwest on the morning of July 1st, they expected to find only local militia. Instead, they encountered cavalry under Union General John Buford, who recognized the defensive potential of the terrain immediately. Buford deployed his forces along McPherson's Ridge, buying crucial time for Union General John Reynolds to arrive with infantry reinforcements. Reynolds understood what Buford had already perceived. The high ground south of town offered the Union Army a formidable defensive position. As he deployed his First Corps, Reynolds turned to his staff and declared, "This is the place to fight a battle." Moments later, a Confederate bullet struck him dead, but his recognition of the terrain's value would prove prophetic. By afternoon, both armies were being drawn inexorably toward Gettysburg. General George Meade, newly appointed commander of the Union's Army of the Potomac, had already identified the advantageous terrain on his maps. He dispatched his trusted engineer, General Gouverneur Warren, to verify the strategic value of the position. The initial Confederate success on July 1st pushed Union forces back through town, but rather than retreat entirely, they re-established their lines along Cemetery Hill, the beginning of what would become known as the Fishhook defensive position. This elevated ground would prove invaluable as more Union troops arrived throughout the night. Few decisions in military history have had such profound consequences as the Union Army's occupation of Cemetery Hill, noted historian James McPherson. The geographical advantage it provided would set the conditions for everything that followed. As darkness fell on July 1st, Lee arrived on the battlefield to find his forces had achieved tactical success, but failed to secure the high ground. He observed the Union position with concern, but lacking intelligence about enemy strength and without his cavalry commander J.E.B. Stuart, decided to continue the engagement rather than maneuver elsewhere. "We have gained a victory today," Lee told General A.P. Hill, "but it has been won at a fearful cost." What he could not yet appreciate was how the terrain he surveyed in the fading light would shape his defeat in the days to come. Dawn broke on July 2nd, 1863, revealing to both armies the full geographical context of their confrontation. The Union Army had established what military historians would later describe as a fishhook formation, a defensive line that curved from Culp's Hill in the northeast, along Cemetery Hill, and down along Cemetery Ridge to two distinctive hills. At the southern end, Little Round Top and Big Round Top. No military engineer could have designed a more perfect defensive position, wrote Colonel Theodore Lyman, a staff officer to General Meade. Nature herself seemed to have shaped the ground for a defensive battle. General Meade arrived on the Itarait battlefield shortly after midnight and immediately recognized the terrain's advantages. At dawn, he called his corps commanders together for a council of war at his headquarters at the widow Lydia Leicester's small farmhouse, situated just behind Cemetery Ridge. There he famously declared his intention to stay and fight it out. Across the valley to the west, General Lee studied the Union position from Seminary Ridge with his trusted lieutenant, General James Longstreet. Longstreet, an advocate of defensive warfare, suggested maneuvering around the Union left to find better ground. "The enemy is there," he said, pointing to Cemetery Ridge, "and I am going to strike him." Lee's decision to attack reflected both his aggressive temperament and a misreading of the topographical challenges before him. Without Stuart's cavalry, he lacked critical intelligence about the full Union deployment and the extent of their geographical advantage. According to accounts published in the Richmond Examiner, General Lee's bold offensive spirit, which had served the Confederacy so well until this point, now confronted the unforgiving mathematics of attacking elevated positions across open ground. The southern end of the Union line initially remained vulnerable. General Daniel Sickles, commanding the Union Third Corps, became concerned about slightly higher ground in front of his assigned position on Cemetery Ridge. Without authorization, he moved his corps forward to occupy the peach orchard, creating a salient in the Union line that extended toward the Confederate position. This unauthorized advance created two problems. It stretched Sickles' forces thin, and it abandoned the natural defensive strength of Cemetery Ridge. When Meade discovered this movement, he rode immediately to confront Sickles. As they spoke, Confederate artillery opened fire, signaling the beginning of Longstreet's assault. "You see, General," Sickles reportedly said, "the enemy is attacking exactly where I said they would." "General," Meade replied grimly, "they could not have hit you so easily if you had stayed where I put you." The southern flank of the battlefield contained crucial terrain features that would determine the day's outcome. Little Round Top, a boulder-strewn hill rising about 140 feet above the surrounding landscape, commanded the Union left flank. By fortunate circumstance for the Union, General Gouverneur Warren, Meade's chief engineer, noticed the hill was unoccupied as Longstreet's assault began. Warren frantically sent messengers seeking troops to occupy this critical high ground. Colonel Strong Vincent's brigade responded, rushing to the hill just minutes before Confederate forces arrived. The 20th Maine Regiment, commanded by Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, took position at the extreme left of the Union line. "Providence has placed us on this ground," Chamberlain told his men, "and we must defend it to the last." As Longstreet's powerful assault pushed Sickles' overextended corps back, the critical nature of terrain became increasingly evident. Union forces retreated to the natural fortress of Cemetery Ridge, while Confederate attacks against the Round Tops were repulsed at great cost. The geographical advantage had begun to assert itself. As the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the battlefield on July 2, 1863, the rocky slopes of Little Round Top became the scene of desperate combat. The 15th Alabama Regiment, having marched over 20 miles that day already, climbed the steep southern face of the hill to strike what they believed was the exposed Union flank. Colonel William Oates, commanding the Alabama troops, later wrote in the Montgomery Advertiser, "We were confronted not only by determined men, but by the very shape of the earth itself. Each step upward drained our energy while the defenders stood firmly on level ground, protected by boulders that seemed placed by the Almighty for their salvation." On the Union side, Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's 20th Maine found itself anchoring the extreme left of the entire Union Army. With ammunition running low after repeated Confederate assaults, Chamberlain ordered a desperate bayonet charge down the slope. The maneuver's success owed as much to the momentum provided by the downhill rush as to the bravery of his soldiers. "The advantage of position compensated for our inferior numbers," Chamberlain later reported. "The hill itself became our ally." While the struggle for Little Round Top has captured much historical attention, equally important was the fight for the rocky landscape of Devil's Den, the wheat field, and the peach orchard. These areas formed a transitional zone between the Round Tops and Cemetery Ridge, where Sickles had placed his Third Corps. The boulder-strewn Devil's Den provided excellent cover for Confederate sharpshooters, who used the natural rock formations as protection while targeting Union artillery positions on Little Round Top. The undulating ground of the wheat field, changed hands 6 times in fierce fighting, each ridgeline and depression becoming a temporary fortress. Meanwhile, on the Union right flank, the heavily wooded slopes of Culp's Hill proved equally decisive. When General Edward Johnson's Confederate division finally attacked the hill after sunset, they found portions of it vacant. Many of its defenders had been sent to reinforce the embattled left flank. Johnson's men occupied the abandoned trenches on the lower slopes, but darkness halted their advance before they could seize the summit. The formidable nature of the Union position was becoming increasingly apparent. General Lee's forces had achieved tactical successes but at tremendous cost, and the core of the Union fishhook remained intact. The geographical advantages that General Meade's army enjoyed, interior lines, elevated positions, and clear fields of fire, had largely negated the Confederate attacks. During the night, the Union 12th Corps returned to Culp's Hill and prepared to retake their lost ground at first light. General Henry Slocum, commanding the right wing of the Union Army, used the terrain masterfully, positioning artillery on the hill's crest to support his infantry. According to the Baltimore American, which published accounts from participants, shortly after the battle, the defenders on Culp's Hill used the contours of the land like maestros. Each boulder and tree trunk multiplied their defensive power. As dawn broke on July 3rd, a 7-hour battle erupted on Culp's Hill. The steepness of the slope forced attacking Confederates to struggle upward, while Union forces fired downhill from behind breastworks reinforced with logs and stones. By mid-morning, the Union had reclaimed all lost ground, securing their right flank. With both flanks of his fishhook position firmly anchored, Meade now possessed what military theorists consider the ideal defensive formation, one that allowed rapid reinforcement of any threatened sector along interior lines, while forcing attackers to travel longer exterior routes. The Army of the Potomac had finally found ground perfectly suited to its defensive strengths, historian Edwin Coddington observed, and Lee was about to make his greatest mistake by attacking the strongest point of that position. The morning of July 3, 1863, found General Robert E. Lee contemplating a battlefield shaped like a giant amphitheater. Having tested both Union flanks the previous day, he now focused his attention on what he perceived as the Federal center, a seemingly vulnerable stretch of Cemetery Ridge held by General Winfield Scott Hancock's Second Corps. "The enemy is there, and I am going to strike him," Lee told Longstreet, pointing across nearly a mile of open fields that gently rose toward the Union position. Longstreet, seeing the suicidal nature of the plan, protested, "General, I have been a soldier all my life. I have been with soldiers engaged in fights by couples, by squads, companies, regiments, divisions, and armies, and should know as well as anyone what soldiers can do. It is my opinion that no 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle can take that position." The terrain that separated the armies consisted of open farmland offering virtually no cover. The gentle slope upward to Cemetery Ridge meant attacking. Troops would be exposed to fire for the entire approach while fighting gravity itself. Union artillery would be able to fire downhill, a significant advantage for accuracy and range. From his command post near the Lutheran Seminary, Lee could see the entire panorama of the battlefield. What he couldn't fully appreciate was how the topographical features favored the defenders. The gentle swale in the fields would hide his approaching troops from Union gunners only briefly, while the stone wall along Cemetery Ridge provided the Federal infantry with a ready-made breastwork, according to the Philadelphia Inquirer's battlefield correspondent. The ground itself seemed to have taken sides in the conflict, providing shelter for the Union defenders while exposing every Confederate soldier to the terrible storm of lead and iron that awaited them. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Confederate artillery opened fire with approximately 150 guns, the largest artillery bombardment ever witnessed on the North American continent. For nearly 2 hours, the barrage attempted to soften the Union center, but many shells overshot their targets due to the difficulty of gauging distance across the deceptive terrain. Union Artillery Chief General Henry Hunt ordered a measured response, conserving ammunition for the infantry, assault he knew would follow. After about an hour, he ordered Union guns to cease firing altogether, a move that convinced the Confederates they had silenced the Federal artillery. At approximately 3 o'clock, the Confederate infantry emerged from the woods along Seminary Ridge. Nearly 15,000 men in 3 divisions, commanded by Generals George Pickett, Johnston Pettigrew, and Isaac Trimble, stepped forward in a line over a mile wide. What followed would become known simply as Pickett's Charge, though Pickett commanded only the Virginia troops on the right of the attack. "Never was there in the history of war such a charge," wrote Confederate General Low Armistead in his final letter, found unfinished after his death. "We went forward as though the whole world depended upon our success." The open ground between the ridges revealed the full cruelty of the terrain. What appeared to be a straightforward advance from Seminary Ridge looked very different to the men making the attack. Small undulations in the ground disrupted formation integrity. A rail fence along the Emmitsburg Road forced the attackers to stop and dismantle it under fire. Streams and ditches further broke the cohesion of the advancing lines. Union artillery, which had largely weathered the Confederate bombardment by taking shelter behind the reverse slope of Cemetery Ridge, now rolled forward and opened fire with devastating effect. From their elevated position, they could aim directly into the mass of advancing infantry. Major General Hancock, commanding the Union center, recognized how the terrain channeled the Confederate attack. "They're coming straight for this clump of trees," he told his staff, correctly identifying the focal point of the assault. As the Confederate lines came within range, Union infantry rose from behind the stone wall and delivered devastating volleys. Despite appalling casualties, some attackers reached a point known as the angle, where the stone wall made a 90-degree turn. Here, for a few brief moments, the battle hung in the balance. General Lewis Armistead, leading a brigade in Pickett's division, placed his hat on his sword and called for his men to follow him over the wall. This momentary breakthrough, achieved at terrible cost, marked the attack's high water mark. Without reinforcements and with Union troops converging from both flanks, another advantage of the fishhook formation, the breakthrough could not be sustained. As the remnants of Pickett's shattered division streamed back across the killing ground on the afternoon of July 3, 1863, the tactical advantages of the Union position became painfully clear. The same open terrain that had exposed the Confederates during their advance now offered them no protection in retreat. Union artillery continued to fire into the withdrawing masses, while Federal sharpshooters targeted officers. General Lee, watching the catastrophe unfold from his position on Seminary Ridge, rode forward to meet the survivors. "It's all my fault," he told them. "It is I who have lost this fight." His acknowledgement spoke volumes about his understanding of how thoroughly the terrain had undermined his offensive strategy. In his official report, later published in the Richmond Dispatch, Lee noted, "The strength of the enemy's position was such that after our troops reached the works, they could not be maintained there." The geographical realities of the battlefield had finally asserted themselves completely. The Union Army's position along Cemetery Ridge, with its natural flanking protections of Culp's Hill and the Round Tops, had proven impregnable to frontal assault. More importantly, it had provided exactly what the long-suffering Army of the Potomac needed: ground that maximized their defensive capabilities while minimizing those of their adversaries. That evening, as a tremendous thunderstorm broke over the battlefield, Lee gathered his generals to plan their retreat. The Confederate Army had lost nearly a third of its fighting strength. About 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. The Union forces had suffered 17,000 casualties, but their position remained intact, and their supply lines were secure. "We must now look to the safety of the Army," Lee told his commanders. The next day, July 4, 1863, notably the nation's Independence Day, the Confederate forces began their withdrawal. The retreat itself revealed another geographical factor that influenced the battle's outcome. Heavy rains had swollen the Potomac River, making the Confederate Army's crossing back into Virginia impossible for several days. Lee's forces were forced to establish a defensive line near Williamsport, Maryland, prepared for a Union counterattack that never fully materialized. General Meade, criticized later for not pursuing more aggressively, was acutely aware of how terrain had favored his defensive victory at Gettysburg. Away from those advantageous heights, he was reluctant to risk his army against Lee's still dangerous forces on ground that might favor the Confederates. according to an account in the New York Tribune, having witnessed the slaughter that resulted. When attacking unfavorable terrain, General Meade showed understandable caution in pursuit. The Army of the Potomac had finally learned to use geography as an ally rather than an enemy. The battle's aftermath brought reflection on both sides about the role of terrain in determining military outcomes. Union engineers produced detailed, topographical maps of the battlefield, noting how each rise and depression had influenced combat operations. These studies would inform military education for generations to come. In Washington, President Abraham Lincoln received news of the victory, with relief but also frustration at Lee's escape. His subsequent letter to Meade acknowledged the significance of the victory, while lamenting the missed opportunity to destroy Lee's army completely. For the citizens of Gettysburg, the battle's end brought only the beginning of their ordeal. The town of 2,500 residents now contained over 20,000 wounded soldiers from both armies. Every public building, church, and many private homes became makeshift hospitals. The surrounding farmland, which had provided natural advantages to the Union Army, was now devastated. Fields trampled, fences destroyed, and the soil polluted with the detritus of combat. William Frasanito, a photographer documenting the aftermath, wrote, "The land itself bears the scars of this terrible conflict. The contours and features that shaped the battle have themselves been reshaped by the violence they witnessed." 4 months later, when President Lincoln arrived to dedicate the military cemetery, he gazed across the landscape from Cemetery Hill, the key terrain that had anchored the Union center. From this vantage point, he could see much of the battlefield: Seminary Ridge to the west, the Round Tops to the south, and Culp's Hill to the northeast. On November 19, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln stood upon the grounds that had, just months earlier, determined the fate of a nation. As he delivered his immortal address dedicating the Soldiers' National Cemetery, the geographical features that shaped the battle surrounded him, silent witnesses to carnage and courage. "We are met on a great battlefield of that war," Lincoln said, acknowledging how this particular landscape had become hallowed ground. Though brief, his speech recognized that the significance of Gettysburg transcended the tactical details of the battle itself. The terrain that had dictated military movements had now become symbolic terrain, ground consecrated by sacrifice. In the years that followed, veterans and civilians alike would return to Gettysburg, drawn by a desire to understand how the battle unfolded across this landscape. By 1895, the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association had begun, preserving the key terrain features and marking unit positions with monuments, creating what would eventually become one of America's most visited military parks. Colonel John Batchelder, the battle's first historian, spent years interviewing participants and mapping troop movements in relation to the terrain. His meticulous work, later published in the Century magazine, established the foundation for understanding how geography influenced each phase of the engagement. No battle in modern history better demonstrates the military maxim that terrain dictates tactics. At Gettysburg, every hill, stream, and rock wall became a decisive factor. Military professionals from around the world traveled to study the battlefield. The newly established Army War College incorporated Gettysburg into its curriculum, using the terrain to teach principles of defensive positioning and the challenges of attacking elevated positions. German, British, and French military attachés walked the ground, taking notes on how topography had multiplied the defensive power of the Union Army. "The Gettysburg battlefield serves as nature's own military academy," wrote Field Marshal Viscount Wolseley after his visit in 1879. "One can read the outcome of each engagement in the contours of the land itself." For the Confederate South, Gettysburg marked what became known as the high water mark of the Confederacy, both literally in terms of the northernmost point of advance and figuratively as the moment when Confederate fortunes began their irreversible decline. The physical spot where General Armistead briefly crossed the stone wall became enshrined as a symbolic location, marked by a monument that still draws visitors today. The Union victory at Gettysburg, secured largely through the advantages of terrain, changed the character of the war. Although 2 more years of bloody conflict lay ahead, never again would Lee's army invade Northern territory. The strategic initiative passed permanently to the Union forces, according to historian Bruce Catton in his Pulitzer Prize-winning work. Geography had finally asserted itself as the Union's most powerful ally. The Northern armies learned to use terrain to their advantage, while the Confederate forces found themselves increasingly constrained by it. The battlefield itself underwent transformation. The town of Gettysburg, which had seen its street pattern serve as a magnet drawing both armies together, recovered gradually and eventually embraced its historical significance. Farms were restored, though farmers would continue to plow up bullets, buttons, and bones for decades. The Round Tops, Culp's Hill, and Cemetery Ridge, once valued purely for their tactical advantages, became pilgrimage sites. Veterans returned to walk the slopes they had defended or attacked, often meeting former enemies and gaining new appreciation for how the land had shaped their experiences. General Longstreet, visiting the battlefield years later, stood on Seminary Ridge looking across at Cemetery Ridge and remarked to a former Union officer, "We should have fought on other ground." This simple statement encapsulated the lesson that military planners would study for generations, that choosing favorable terrain can be as important as the number or quality of troops engaged. In 1913, on the 50th anniversary of the battle, veterans from both sides gathered at Gettysburg for a final reunion. Many walked with difficulty across the same fields they had charged across in their youth. At the stone wall where Pickett's charge had reached its climax, elderly Confederate veterans met their Union counterparts. Together they gazed across the deadly ground between Cemetery and Seminary Ridges, now peaceful farmland once more. "Land remembers, even when men forget," wrote one veteran in his diary that day. "Standing here now, one can almost feel how the shape of this ground determined our destinies." Today, visitors to Gettysburg National Military Park can still read the battle through the terrain. The preservation of key geographical features allows modern observers to understand how elevation, lines of sight, cover and concealment, and obstacles shaped the combat. From the commanding view at Little Round Top to the exposed approach to Cemetery Ridge, the landscape continues to tell its story. Military historians now recognize Gettysburg as a classic example of how geography shapes conflict. The Union's fishhook position along naturally defensible terrain forced Lee into increasingly desperate attacks against unfavorable ground. The Confederate defeat stemmed not just from tactical decisions, but from the fundamental challenge of attacking an enemy who held the geographical advantages. As the historian Shelby Foote observed in the widely acclaimed PBS documentary, The Civil War, "Geography is destiny in warfare." At Gettysburg, the Army of Northern Virginia finally encountered terrain that nullified its offensive excellence, while the Army of the Potomac found ground perfectly suited to its defensive strengths. The Battle of Gettysburg stands as a testament to the enduring military principle that terrain shapes tactics, influences strategy, and often determines outcomes. The rolling Pennsylvania landscape that witnessed those 3 fateful days in July 1863 continues to teach this lesson to each new generation of visitors who walk its hallowed ground.